Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Okay, this computer always takes forever to start. And so while we're waiting for this, I give you a brief review of what we did in last week. So we're mainly talking about what are the non-depository financial institutions, right? Like insurance companies, pension funds, investment companies, and investment banks. And particularly in the investment company, we talk about a mutual fund which has open, closed-end, unit trust, and the exchange-traded funds, right? And then we also talk about the hedge fund and there's a private equity fund. So the key is those are all the basic background knowledge that I would like you to know about the financial market, but those are pretty much the organizational structure in the industry, right? Not much on the concepts. So for all those financial institutions, you mainly only need to know what they do, what is their profit model, and what could be the risk come from. That's the key knowledge points for them. Okay, this is, we're losing it again. What's going on this thing? Okay. All right. Then after the financial institution, we started the main conceptual of this class. And the key we're going to talking about is how institutions affects the financial market development, and in turn it affects the economic development of the country. Right, and the institutions, that's I think we should come. The institutions we talk about can include like laws, right, and the guarantee investor protection. Second is the institutional development in terms of whether you're the enforcement of law, etc. Then we also talk about the state, which is the government, how the government might interfere, and then also the family and community culture value, etc. Right? And then also in last week, we started on the first lecture, which is on the law, finance, and economic growth. That's where we stopped in the last week, right? So the law and finance, economic growth literature basically starts with the LSV paper, that a journal of research. Where is it? Let me just start a new one. And it's basically talking about how the law protects investor. And then this protection affects the financial development in the country. And then in turn, it affects the economic growth of the country, right? And we were we were talking about what are the investor protections that are important, which including the equity investor, which is shareholder protection or shareholder rights, also creditor rights. And you know, the shareholders are the equity holders of the firm, right? And the creditors are the bondholder of the firm. And also the creditor holder could also be bank. When the bank lends into the firm, the bank will be the creditor. If you invest by corporate bond on the market, you are the creditor, right? And so so-called investor protection on the equity holder or the credit holders are mainly when the payment or when the management of firm are at conflicts where the management and the shareholders or the creditors cannot come upon agreement, or the firm are in facing of bankruptcy, etc. What are the law providing to the shareholder or creditor to protect their rights? Okay, so that's basically the detailed arrangement of how, when the conflicts should be solved, right? Or what is allowed, what's not allowed on the management. Okay, so this is where we stopped last week, so we can continue there. And we can first looking at what are the detailed shareholder rights. Okay, so we should be on this one, right? So the legal system, legal enforcement, government, and informal mechanism. Okay, so we talk about this, the creditor rights as well, the common law, we talk about this, right? I think we talk about this, but we can quickly go through this, right? The shareholders, the most basic one you have heard a lot is one share, one vote. And so most of the country has one share, one vote. Now, why one share, one vote is a protection for shareholders? Now, imagine, which is actually China is now trying to do, reverse the trend again, is think about it, if the management issue, let's put in the situation of it's not one share, one vote. Say there's management issue different shares. For one category of share, each share has 10 voting rights, while another category of share is one share, one vote, right? So when the firm has important management proposal to be voted, say the shareholder who holds one share, 10 votes, if they hold, say, 20%, they aggregate hold 20% of firm's share. But because of their one share have 10 votes, they actually become almost 200 in scale of their votes, right? While the other shareholder category, say altogether holding 80% of the share, but they share have one share, one vote. Now they only have 80 votes, right? So in this situation, this shareholder who even holding less of firm's share actually have more power of saying on the firm's management, right? So for the shareholders who holding this one share vote, it's unfair, right? And typically, when the firm, if they do some practice like this, they typically sell this one share, one vote to the public investor and holding this one share, multiple votes in the maybe founders or the management, etc., right? And this is the unfair treatment of the firm insiders versus outsider, right? So that's why if it's one share, multiple votes share, or dual class share exist, it's not a good investor protection, right? So one share, one vote is the basic investor protection. Now, second is anti-director rights. The anti-director rights measures if the minority shareholders are not happy with management, what they can do to sort of turn over the management, right? And so that will involve this minority shareholder put on proposal and to overturn the management, but then this proposal will have to be voted on, right? And we know the minority shareholder outside often hold very small shares, so their cost of participating in those shareholder activism is too costly relative to the small percentage of shares they hold, right? So there is an issue of the free rider issue results most of the minority shareholders might not do anything. Right, so the law might protect some arrangement in this situation, allowing the small shareholders much easier to participate. And for example, whether they can mail in their votes, right? This is a proxy voting arrangement. And the second arrangement is they do not ask shareholders to deposit shares before the vote. That gives them the liquidity on the market whilst they still can participate in the activism, and if not successful, they sell. So they're allowing this negotiation room there. Okay, so these are some examples of the shareholder rights. Now, there is also a cash flow rights versus voting rights difference. And the difference between them is usually coming from a pyramid structure. Now, suppose company, what we should say? I mean, very typical is you guys all know lec3, right? And lec3 has a lot of firms, and each of these firms are going to holding more firms. Now, the top of the pyramid, let's for company A, holds, say, company B and C. Company B, again, holds company D, C, F. So we're going to look at A, B, and D, right? Now, say A holds 50% of B, and B holds 15% of D. That's a simple case here. Now, what is the cash flow rights from D to A? First, D to B, 50%, right? And then B to A, again, 50%. So the cash flow rights for the A holding to the D is only 25%. But what is the voting rights? Because A holds 50% of B, say this is a majority shareholder, the rest of 50% are held by public investors, small investors, right? And so basically A has almost an absolute saying on B's management, on the voting. While B, say to the D, similar situation, 50% of D are insider holder or the majority, a major shareholder of B, the rest of 50% are listed and sold to the public investor. Now, B also has the absolute voting power, almost voting power on the D, right? Now, in this situation, what is the voting rights from A to D? It's going to remain as 50%, right? And this discrepancy will be called the voting cash flow rights and voting rights difference is a measure of the conflicts of interest, right? Now, suppose, say, if anything that is, say, destructive, let's say just destructive to the company D, which is some other transaction benefit to the company A, which, for example, will be company D sell certain assets to company A at a cheaper price. Now, in this process, how much does A lose? 20%, 25%, because that's the cash flow rights, right? But his voting rights has 50%. So the 75% will be lost, have to go to the minority shareholder of company D and a minority company shareholder of B, right? So this discrepancy often will cause this conflicts of interest. Later, when I'm talking about tunneling, I will show you exactly more how this is going to be cannot, right? And another possibility is instead of searching A, because A also holds company C, let's say A actually holds 100% of company C. And if this share selling is go from D to C, the company A actually have all the benefits, right? And he lose 25% in company D, but gain 100% in company C, right? So this is benefits A, but hurting the minority shareholders. And so this is when the cash flow rights and the voting rights are different, it can create conflicts like this. And so if you have large discrepancy in them, it's usually a not good share structure for the minority shareholders. Now, the overall, this LSV's paper they're looking at, they're overall looking around the world. We already talked about the categories world countries by common law versus civil law, right? Common law example will be like United States, UK, Australia, Singapore, most of those UK once colonized countries. And the civil law countries include French, which is French civil law, and then German, Taiwan, which is the German civil law, and then the North Europeans. And also, of course, those French-related colonized countries or Japan, Taiwan, they're all in the German civil laws, etc. Now, so when they're looking at the legal arrangement around the world, the common finding is the common law countries typically have the best legal protection to the shareholders around the world. 39% of them allow shareholders to vote by mail. They never block shares for the shareholder meetings. They have highest, which is 94% of incidents of law protecting oppressed minority. Oppressed minority means minority are not happy with the management, then they are active them. They generally require relatively little share capital to call an actual shareholder meeting. That means if you can pull minority shareholder together, accumulated to 9% of the shares, you can already ask the management to hold a shareholder meeting to address the problem. And among the civil law, so the three civil laws, the French civil law countries seems to give the worst legal protection to the shareholders. Okay, that's the description or the observation of the legal protection of shareholders around the world. Right? And so this is the just like some legal incidents example of how during the financial aging crisis, there's the disputes between the minority shareholders and companies, especially the minority shareholders accusing the majority shareholder of stealing. Right, so these are just some incidents. Now, these are the legal thing. Now, another institution is accounting standards, right? Now, accounting standards is, you guys all know, it's very important, right? Because how much the numbers the investor can trust the earnings that are disclosed. And then the banks have to rely on those accounting numbers to making decision on this is very, are we still on the same page? Yeah. To making the loan decisions, and even the enforcement, like the exchanges, have to rely on the accounting numbers to decide whether the firm meets the listing share standards, whether they are having a fair disclosure, etc., all those things, right? So they are very important. So then in terms of the accounting standards, this else they're looking at around the world, they find the best accounting standards are on the Scandinavian, which is the North European countries, followed by the common law countries, the German civil law countries, and the French civil law countries. So that's, again, that's a description they find around the world what is accounting standards look like. Now, what about credit rights? Now, credit rights, many of you probably have heard, even among the credit rights, there will be senior creditors and junior creditors, right? So the creditors will have how the credit rights is arranged between the total credit right or the debt holders versus equity shareholders, You guys probably have heard a lot of the agency problem, right? Now, also, this creditor rights have to relevant to how the arrangement is done to protect the junior creditors to the senior creditor. What does junior creditors to senior creditor mean? How many of you understand this one? Junior creditor versus senior creditor. Exactly. So the senior creditor, in case of the firm go bankruptcy, the senior creditor has the right to claim the whatever salvage value first before the junior creditor gets into it, right? Now, then you have a matter of, say, supposedly, I'm just giving a hypothetical situation. There are 20 million of, not too much 20 million, say 2 million of senior credit and another 5 million of junior credit. And the firm is going into bankruptcy, right? And its assets might have an assets value of, let's say, fairly could be close to 6 million. Or say, let's make it simpler, 4 million, okay? 4 million values, right? Now, that's the market value. But in time of bankruptcy, the firm often go into fire sale, right? The fire sale your matters, if you want to liquidate those assets very quickly, you might not be able to get your full market value, right? And in this case, say if the senior credits, they don't care about junior credits, and if the law gives the full collateral value or the control of those assets to the senior credits, what the senior credits likely to do is they only care about they had 2 million. So they would choose to sell them quickly, right? And it may suffer saying they may only get 2.8 million or 2.5 million. And they take the 2 million and only 0.8 goes to the remaining junior creditors. In this process, the junior creditors' interests get hurt, right? Okay, this is good. So the creditor rights, you're looking at both between creditor over to equity holder and among the creditors, right? Now, this is all about how this rights being protected is all in the situation if the firm are default on the bank loan or the firm going to bankruptcy, right? And how the law specify the arrangement or who controls the assets, etc., to ensure they get a protection. Now, for one example is called automatic stay on the assets, right? So the automatic stay on the assets is saying even the firm if the firm are going into bankruptcy, does the creditor can get to the possession of the collateral? This is on this arrangement, right? So this is called reorganization, or sometimes you heard restructuring, which is all about the firm going through a bankruptcy procedure. The firm might go complete bankruptcy, close, or they may go restructure, right? So when you hear this restructuring, so if the secured credits is getting the possession of the loan, that means the collateral. That means the management now have no control of those assets, right? So that's especially you don't have this automatic stay on this, right? And this is an arrangement in favor of the creditors, right? Because they don't let the management just take. Or on the other side, if they don't do the arrangement, they let the management stay on the control of the assets, it's not good for the creditors, right? And then so this is the example to say, some countries can seek protection from creditor by filing for reorganization without creditor consent. What does it mean? That means the management can file for the bankruptcy without consulting the creditors. Because that is in the case of the creditor, remember we said the restructuring or when the firm going to bankruptcy, it doesn't have to close. It can go through restructure, right? And when they go through restructure, there's many kinds of things can do. For example, the senior creditor can choose to turn or convert some of their debt into shareholder shares, or they can, or the management can invite other firms, certain investors to come in, or they can choose to default on some of the debt. So there's various kinds of practice they can do to restructure the firm. So all this is going to, those arrangements is going to affect the creditor's rights, because when the firm going to the bankruptcy point, it's because their equity goes to zero, right? All the assets value supposedly, theoretically, should goes to the creditor. But now if the management are actually allowing to how to securitize or restructuring those assets without creditor's consent, it's hurting the creditor's rights. Right? So this is in U.S. Chapter 11 is actually this arrangement that gives management a great deal of power. And in some other countries, creditor consent is needed to file for legal organization, which is, for example, in German, you would have this choice. And often you see the Germans creditor continuing to create shareholders. Okay, so is it clear? So that's the basic concept of the credit rights. Now, for the credit rights, what is the situation looking like around the country? The common law country still typically offers creditors stronger legal protection against the manager. They have the highest, which is 72% of incidents of no automatic stay on the assets. They don't let the management automatic stay. And then with two exceptions, they guarantee that secured credits are paid first in the German, civil, Scandinavian. And then the common law country also have 72% preclude manager from seeking court protection from creditors. They also have the highest 78% of the incidents removing managing in organizing procedure completely. That means not only you can't control the assets, you don't have the power to influence the decision. Okay, so these. And what about French civil law? The French civil law offers the weakest credit protection. There's only 26% have no automatic stay, and relative few that assume the security creditors are paid first, and fewer 40%. Okay, so then the German civil law family countries are strongly pro-credit. This is again this. Okay, so that's, we don't have to know too much of the detail. Then that's the credit rights around the world looking like. Now, what about enforcement? Right? We can have this in shareholder protection law. There's also a bunch of the other security laws, and all this will affect the investors' trust on this financial market. Then, how to enforce the law matter, right? The enforcement of the law usually can be measured from several things. Efficiency of the judicial system. For example, how long takes a court to solve a case, right? Do we have Indians in our class? Okay, we don't have Indians. Okay, so one example is in India, I used to have let Indian students speak up. You could file a case and waiting for years and years, and the court don't give you a hearing. That's a typical example of terrible, extreme, not a typical, extreme bad example of inefficiency, right? And the law of law. Law of law is basically the respect of the law. How do we do this example? Oh, you guys from China, so that will be easy. So sometimes you will see the law has a label, but the government favors something else, right? And in this case, does the law of law overturns government decision? That will be the respect of regarded as a high law of law, right? So that's why, for example, in U.S., you can see court or people sue government, right? That's a typical sign of the rule of law gets more respected. Now, corruption, right? Does the court is the court fair, the judge fair? Risk of expropriation by the government, and likelihood of contract repudiation by the government. So those are the law and orders. And then in terms of the law enforcement, the Scandinavian country and the German civil law countries are at the top. Well, I think which is almost consistent with our concepts or our feeling of their culture, right? Those parts of the world's culture are very law-based, you have to follow. And the common law countries are behind above two families, but ahead of French civil law countries. Okay. Now, so this we described, the legal and the enforcement of legality, right? And remember this picture, we haven't talked about the state and the family informal mechanism there. So the LSV, doing this description of the law and the enforcement around the world, is to make a point to saying, if you have good legal protection, you encourage investors to participate on the financial market, right? Investing in the firms, lending money or bank lending or buying corporate bond, etc. And this will help develop the financial market because people, households are more willing to participate. And then you will have better or more developed or large or more efficient financial market that allow firms to get financing, get funding, right? And it will be relatively easy for the firm to get funded, and then they can invest in when there's good investment opportunities. And along this logic, they argue that the country have good legal protection on the investors, also have good large external or more efficient external financing market, will grow better or grow faster or more developed, right? So logically, this all goes through, and then if you put their logical on a graph, this is something I did actually quite a long time ago, but it's always stays. So if we put x-axis as investor protection, y-axis is external market. And following the law finance argument the LSV proposed, right? So we put the country according to their score of investor protection, score of external market, and we put them on this, what we should see. The countries on the very top right should be those very developed countries and growing fast, etc. all this, right? Growing fast, everything better. And the country at the bottom left should be those who are poor, who are growing slowly, who are not growing at all, those type of countries. Now, so we put the majority of the countries, the key countries, in this graph. We see their argument, the logic holds for most of the countries. For example, you see Hong Kong, Singapore on the very top, right? And UK, US also on the very top. Malaysia, this is not really that correct, right? And now on the very bottom, you have Mexico, Indonesia, Pakistan, India, okay, maybe Pakistan a little bit here, but then you see China and India from here. China here doesn't look that right, given the fast growth economy. And then you also see example like Germany, France, and Taiwan. They are at the bottom, even though they are at the right side, but they are pretty bottom at the external market. But these are also very developed countries. So what this graph sort of to picture the logic of LSV basically shows that logic may hold for some countries, but not for all the countries, right? So that will lead us to thinking the next examples. They have been studying doing why Germany is not the case or France is not the case, right? For example, Germany don't have large external market, but they have the very developed, stable banking industry, etc. Now, in our course, because we're talking about Asian capital market, I'm going to next talking about China. Why China doesn't fit into this logic, and how do we explain China's growth?
So what's the measurement of
the external measurement of the market is a score best looking at how big and also how, actually later on, the following slides I'm going to show you, we have slides on that, how big and how efficient are the equity market, stock market, and the banking industry, particularly the banking credits to the private sectors. Okay, so it will be a bunch of measurements, and then they got aggregate those measurements together to develop sort of a ranking score. You guys, this is a very annoying projector. Okay, are we clear? Do we have any questions on the LSV's law finance growth logic or their conventional growth model? All good? Okay. Okay, if it's all good, then we go into the next to looking at why China is a counterexample of why China is so puzzling in this law, under this conventional growth model, and how do we understand China's growth, right? So this has been an incredible, difficult, but a key economy to watch in view of its opacity and a distorted financial system that's still, people have been arguing this for over 20, 30 years and still looking the same to them. Okay. Now, how do we see this thing? First, why China's growth is puzzling to the convention, to a lot of Western scholars, or maybe even many scholars, and that it doesn't fit into the conventional growth model. Now, so this is actually, I'm basically telling you one of the research I done many, many years ago, but this is the starting point, and since we did that paper, and there has been a large literature following what we were doing and trying to explore further. Okay, so basically what we show in the paper is, we show in that the non-listed private sector has been largely contributed to China's economic growth. And this is, every day you guys looking at the financial, you hear yourself, your relatives, or friends, they are all so hot about the equity market, right? The stock market. But think about it, the stock market has been a very small portion of China's economy, right? So there was it started in the 90s, and it has several hundred firms listed early days, and by end of the 90s, close to 1,000. And nowadays, maybe 3,000, even adding the small firms, I think still less than 4,000, right? And compared to China's economy, how many firms do you guess there are? Millions of it. Maybe next time I should show you a graph of China. I have all the firms, actually all the large firms, listed or unlisted large firms, how they located on China's map. Maybe I should bring this, would be cool to see. Okay, so the listed firm is a very small portion of the economy. That's the first second, right? And the growth, it's again, the growth of the listed firm are not necessarily looking that good either. I guess you guys hear a lot of horror story of people losing money on the stock market, right? There's, of course, people making money, but there's more earning money. And if you're looking at the stock index, right now is Shanghai stock is how much? 2,700, right? And this is like the same as 10 years ago. Okay, so the non-listed private sector largely contribute, and not necessarily SOE and the listed sectors, right? The SOE has been shrinking. And even though you see a lot of large SOE giants are formed during the past 20 years, but those are mainly the merger acquisition since going, right? Now, according to the LSV, right, the law and institution promote economic growth, which apply to the Chinese. If you can't apply to China, you can apply to the SOE and the listed sectors because they are getting favored and protected from the government, right? But however, these sectors are growing slower than the private sector. And then this is the phenomenon we observed in China. And then we're looking into putting China into the LSV setting, looking at what are their credit rights and what are their shareholder rights, right? So if you compare China, the credit rights are pretty bad, right? So I'm not going to look into the number anymore. Credit rights are pretty bad. The shareholder rights are equally bad. And then the legal system, which in terms of enforcement, how could we, right? So, okay, this is bad, but on the paper it's still bad, but not quite bad, right? Now, what about the practice of law, which is looking at the enforcement? You look at the efficiency of the judicial system, law of law, corruption, etc. And when we're doing this research, most of those numbers for China are not able to be found. But I can give you an anecdotal observation we had. So at that time, this is already more than 10 years ago, and nowadays probably getting relatively better, but we don't know how much better getting up. So at the time when we doing this more than 10 years ago, the majority of the judge we looking at in China, they do not have law degrees. Okay, and the total number of lawyers in China at that time were about the same number of lawyers in California. And you guys know California, right? California in US. But then think about the population difference, right? Now, we have to admit in the past decades, things are getting better, right? There's law schools, a lot of lawyers get graduated, and a lot of judges are maybe required to attending courses, and all the new graduates of lawyer, their career, improve, promoted, they become judges. So things are getting better, but we no longer do this number. I didn't follow these numbers, but by looking at the practice from various kinds of news and a case being decided by the court or how the lawyer might get into trouble, I doubt this is catching up with the Western countries, okay? Now, if we compare China, not to the developed countries, but to the other emerging countries like India, Pakistan, South Africa, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, etc. Right? So if we compare to this, again, some of the number are not seen, but the corruption in China is, I don't know why it's bad. I mean, India is pretty bad too, but on the paper, it looks good. Anti-direct rights in China is 3, perhaps somewhere in the middle. One share, one vote, okay. Credit rights on the low side, right? So it's not that impressive either. But among all those emerging countries, China actually has been probably growing the best. I mean, these are not only emerging countries; they are also big. I mean, another emerging country doing very well, people haven't paid enough attention, is probably Vietnam. Right? This is a country that has been growing very well. Now, here comes the external financing market measurement earlier he was asking. So how do we measure external market development? So earlier we were talking about law investor protection, right? Now, what about external market? So basically, these are the measurements. The measurements are structure size, so first, structure size, structure activity, or structure efficiency. All these measures is a relevance of what's going on with this thing. This is so annoying, and I don't see anything on my computer. So the structure measures is basically all the measurement looking at how the market compare to the banks. For example, structure size will be measured, compare how big is the market relative to the banks. So it's measured by, I can't really say, this is a log of the market cap divided by bank credit, right? So that's the measurement. And the structure activity is looking at the actual transactions, because market cap is different from the turnover transactions, right? So the structure activity is a log of value traded on the capital market over the bank credit. And the bank credit usually use bank private credit, means the bank loan made to the private sector. Why you use this? Because, for example, in China, a lot of loan might be directed by the government, right? Particularly the China Development Bank that often was policy loans that direct to, it doesn't measure any development of the banking sector. Now, structure efficiency is to looking at market capitalization, log of market capitalization, multiple the overhead cost ratio. Now, what is overcost ratio? This overcost ratio is a measurement of the efficiency in banks. Basically, they're looking at the non-interest expenses divided by the total assets. Basically, the reason is why this is an efficiency measure. Most of the assets of the bank, what are the most of the assets of the bank is? They are loans, right? They are the loans they made to the corporations. And in the loans, the bank, what is the cost to have this funding? Deposit interest rate, right? The bank paid to the depositors. And what is the income getting from this loan? The interest charged on this corporate loans, right? Now, that's the profit is the interest margin. But in doing this transaction, the bank will incur non-interest expenses, right? The basic operations. So the cost part have not only the interest paid to the depositors, but also the other expenses, right? So this other expenses, how big it is, measures the efficiency, right? Say for each $1 of the loan assets, what is the ratio or percentage goes to the non-interest expenses, right? In the extreme case, if the non-expenses are very big, as the deposit interest, it might exceeding the loan interest rate, then the bank is going to be losing money. The more business they do, they're going to losing money, right? So that's a concept of the overhead cost. So the structure efficiency is basically looking at market capitalization ratio of multiple the overhead cost ratio. The market cap ratio is a ratio of domestic equity listed on the domestic exchange over the GDP. That basically measures how big is the portion of the economy is listed, right? So these are all the structure measurement of external market. And the second set of measurement is the finance size, finance activity, and these four measures are measuring the total size, not the relative size, but the total size of market and the bank adding together, how much it is, right? So now it's a log of market capitalization multiple private credit ratio. And you guys know how the log operates, right? So if you have log market capitalization ratio multiple private credit ratio, which is equivalent to log of market capitalization plus log of private credit, right? So that's why it's a sum. It's a total size. And the finance activity, again, it's similar. So it's the traded activity, the value traded plus the private credit ratio, and the finance efficiency, and the right. And then this is because again the log-wise multiple, it's over. You can't numerical, you can't derive it. Now, what is private credit ratio? It's the credit by depository money of money banks and the other financial institutions to the private credit over GDP. Basically, the total private credit in the economy, how big it is relative to the GDP. Right, so these are the finance measures. And then last one is structure regulatory. The structure regulatory, in a way to most of them, is actually measuring a concept last week we talked about universal banking versus the separate banking, right? So basically looking at, are the commercial banks allowed to engage in security, firm operation, insurance, and real estate banking, right? If the commercial banks are allowed to engage in security or the insurance, this will be already being called universal banking, right? And firm operation, which is, again, that's a different sort of related to credit rights. Are the banks allowed to convert their debt to equity if the firm are going into restructuring? For example, in China or US usually doesn't allow this, but in Germany it's allowed. Right? And the real estate business, and this is a regulation, how we should say this? Basically, we know the real estate are less liquid, which if you recall we talked on the very first class, remember the loan and the loan association, right? Because real estate might involve much longer period, and if you directly invest in it, it makes the bank even tight more capital into it, right? So this is a sort of a stability control for the banking industry. Okay, so those are the measurements typically people use to measure how the market or external market are developed in a country. Question? Clear, right? It's pretty much straightforward. So if then, when we're looking at those measurements and we compare China to the other countries were grouped into English origin, French origin, German origin, and the Scandinavian. Right? So these earliest is common law versus civil law, right? Now, we actually see most of those, particularly the structure activities in China is pretty bad. So what I want to emphasize is actually this first measurement. Bank credit over GDP, right? Now I have two numbers here. One is 1.11 and one is 0.24. Now the definition should be private credit, and all the other countries or the legal origin average are private credit. In China, the 0.24 is the private credits part. And you can see if we're using the private credit measure, China is very small, right? And this ratio is only about 1/3 of other countries. While most of the other countries may have, like for example, German origin has almost all of the bank private credits are as big as GDP. China has about 1/4 only, right? The other countries about 2/3 or half. Well, but what is this 1.11? This is the total credits. Disregarding whether the bank credits goes to the private sector or state-owned sectors. Remember, the private sector actually included listed firm already. So this goes to 1.11. So what you from here can see is China do have a very large banking industry, right, compared to GDP. But the majority of the financing supports the bank providing is to the SOEs. Okay. Now the overhead cost in China is very bad, 0.12, while most of the other countries is below 0.05. So the efficiency of the bank are very bad, right? Very inefficient. So basically you can see this, China have a very large but inefficient banking industry, and the credits goes to mainly the SOEs. That's basically the pictures. Now, in recent years, it's again getting relatively better. I mean, partly because of the listed sector are expanding, a lot of the small boards getting, right? And okay, so and also the property rights protection. Remember, the property law protection was implemented in 2007, and that also makes the bank more willing to lend to the private sector. Okay, so this is actually basically I have said. Okay, on the structure activity and structure size, so it's the relative comparing the market, financial market, to the banking industry. Again, showing that China's banking sector is much larger than the financial markets. On the efficiency, then again, the stock market is much more efficient than the banks, because the banks is just very inefficient. Maybe on this I can say something else to encourage you guys. I have been doing this how should I say this? I have been a professor for over 12 years, and I also do consulting for some industries, and have a lot of interaction with the investment banks or commercial banks in international, not in China. And the typical impression, and also I can see it as well, is China's banking industry or financial industry, they use the word still quite unsophisticated. And also what you see is China needs a lot of financial industry experts or professionals. So you guys are overseas, that give you an opportunity to learn more and gain more experience. And I think that is going to be a large career potential in China. But of course, we have to admit in China the career potential involves much more than just the financial expertise. Okay. Now so then if we're looking at, so that we see how the protection looks like, they're pretty bad and will be even worse for the private sector, right? And the private sector are getting less financing. But how do they grow? So we're looking at that time, this is much older studies, we didn't extend. And the private sectors has the industry output are consistently much better than the state and listed. And the investment is also consistently relatively better to the state and listed. But the difference, if you're looking at the difference between this column and this column in terms of output versus the difference between the investment, you will see the private sector are also much more efficient. Go ahead. I have to move the mouse. This is doing remote control again. Okay. This is very annoying. I need to tell the tech support to fix this thing. Ground floor 711. Okay. Right? And the employees, the private sector start to employ more workers as well. That's, of course, the development stage. Okay, so overall, so what we sort of describe and then are showing is this puzzle of the growth, right? Okay. So this is very weird, right? Can I fix this? Maybe. Okay. Okay, so we basically examine China in the context of raw finance and growth, and we find that China is not fitting very well, right? So the non-listed private sectors grow faster than the listed and SOE sector, even though the SOE sectors are protected better. And the non-listed listed private sector rely less on the bank credits, and the banking sector is large but not efficient. And the TVs have a lot of employment, but the TVs now, as we know, they're mostly gone, right? This is on the privatization, but it doesn't mean those businesses are completely gone. Instead, they might be further privatized by, bought by the individuals, right? Or some of them gets a joint venture with maybe SOEs or maybe foreign investors, right? It's just that their legal status of the business are no longer called TVs because all the ownership changed, right? But what we also find is there are very large informal financing and governance mechanism in place in the private sector, which was my example you guys could hear is, you probably heard the business lend to each others, right? That's using Wenzhou as an example. Oh, how many of you know Wu Ying? Wu Ying? Okay, so you guys know. Okay, so let me stay with this case a little bit. This is, of course, it's an extreme case, right? So more than 10 years ago, almost 20 years ago. So she sort of doing informally, like a financial intermediation, he pull assets or pull money or funding from many people, right? And then he will invest in those businesses. We are not going to make comments on whether those businesses are profitable or not, but what happens on the paper, on the history, recorded history is the government accused her of illegal fundraising. What should be the right words? I shouldn't use this one. Confiscated her assets, right? And taking over, let's say the words take over the assets, and charged her as illegal doing business, and she is sentenced to death, right? Is she still alive or she already been killed? I don't know. Anyway, but she's from Wenzhou. And at Wenzhou, this kind of practice of pooling assets together, then invest, is actually quite common, okay? Her case is an extreme case. There's a lot of background. Let's not talk about it in the class, too complicated political stuff. And so it's a common practice. And now, even nowadays, you guys hear Wenzhou Business Group, right? They go together, invest here. They go together, invest in another country. They go together, go to Italy. This is kind of practice, right? They don't go through the formal banking sector or etc. Now, of course, now in Zhejiang or Wenzhou area, because the banking regulation gets relaxed now, allowing a lot of private ownership, many of those business groups are actually starting holding banks. Okay. But this you can see, it's an informal, right? Or you might also heard underground money house in China, right? That's another one in the early days was more often. Now, also, those are the financing. But what about investor protection, right? You protect from the government or is just one aspect you want to think about protect. But most of the protection you're thinking about is actually your business transactions, right? You have the contract, would it be enforced? Right? What you deliver the goods, but the other person is not paying, how do you get it solved? Right? And the other person is copying your products or stealing your clients, how you solve those disputes. Right? Those are the protection or the governance. Or you have multiple business partners together, but then later on you guys are not happy with each other, you're dividing the assets, how you do all those things. Right? And in China, what they used to do, I mean, nowadays they start to go to court more because now the legal enforcement are starting to improve. But they used to often is, if on the countryside, TV, etc., they go to the local government. They sometimes go to the mutual friends to solve the problem. They go to local government. In the 80s or 90s, I'm from Jiangsu, that's where I grew up. My uncle is a local business official who deals with commerce. One of his jobs at this time is often to visit other local officials because our local businessmen are in conflicts or sometimes they develop a business as well. So the local officials involve a lot to bring the businessmen together across the regions, but also to solve their disputes. Right, that's how they solve the problem instead of going to the court. But nowadays, this local government's role is decreasing, or informally going on. Could have been you have relationship, private relationship, then that might still going on, but it's decreasing a lot. Right. So a lot of informal financing and governance had played a significant role to help the China's economy to kickstart in this fast-growing period. And since most of you know this, right? So since China started open door in 1978, and by 2008, 30 years, and those 30 years, it's a double-digit growth rate. Only in the recent decades, it starts below 10%. And during these 13 years, the informal mechanisms are actually playing the key role there. Now, the growth puzzle of China, that's this, right? So despite its weak legality for investors' protection and underdeveloped financial system, China has been one of the most fast-growing economy in the past 30 years, since the time we're doing it, right? So this is a puzzle in the conventional law finance growth context. Okay, so that's the lesson. Now, what we're going to next class, so we're going to take a break, and when you come back, we're going to talk is how do we understand, even though I already give you some aspects, right? And to understand China's growth, even without the legal in place. But I'm not saying the legal thing is bad. All I'm saying is, what if the country don't have good legal practice in place? What could be helping, right? And if those mechanisms can helping, that means those mechanisms must have their own advantages as well. Is that right? So this is what, when you come back, we talk about that. Then I'll also hand out the project guideline. Okay, so come back at 12:30. Yeah, up to the end of the class. Okay.
I tried to email team members from the list and asking whether they are from the undergraduate or postgraduate. Actually, I got to wait 2 or 3 days for them to reply, saying from the undergraduate or my team members are from undergraduate, so I can't.
You are graduate.
I'm graduate.
Okay.
So is there any
Yeah,
way
I
you can
have
see
it.
which team is?
How do I do this thing? What are you helping me to do?
Just mute all the mic.
Oh.
So don't get recorded.
This is not my iPhone.
So I currently just randomly picked up team, say team 26. I enrolled myself into that, but I tried to contact them 2 days ago, and I still haven't got any replies from them. And I also tried other teams with 4 members.
But you don't get reply for them, or you want to change? I
I'm
would
not
prefer
sure
you
whether
not
they-
to change.
Yeah, I also don't want to change, but I cannot get in touch with these team members. So
Yeah, they are more, unfortunately, they are not responding. Yeah, I can't do anything.
yeah, so
You just have to
I
wait
just
for
want
them.
to make sure they are, at least one of them are from the postgraduate, so I won't affect their marking criteria, marking scheme. Otherwise, if they decided they want to stick
Okay,
with,
then I don't know yet. Okay. Can we see each of them?
I tried, but you can see the
This
email.
number? You can see this as well, right?
No, I can't.
Can you tell by this? Or you can email them. How do you email them?
The message button. Yeah.
Oh.
This is the only way I can
Okay.
contact them.
Can I tell by their numbers?
I'm not sure. The number is only indicating when they are enrolled into ANU. This is probably, yeah. This is me, which is
You are graduate.
postgraduate.
Postgraduate. There must be, because I think this number should indicate, because
when you as master students, you take this in year 1 or year 2, right? But for the undergraduate, they have to 2 years 3, I think.
Oh.
Yeah. So it should
So I should stick
looks
with
like
this
they
one.
are graduate. Mostly are graduate students. Yeah.
I just try to. Or can you just? I drop down the email address. I will send them emails instead of sending them messages by Wordle. In case they just don't pay attention to the Wordle message.
You mean ask me to send an email? For
No. I will drop down the email address because I have no access to these ID numbers. I can only send the Wordle message. But
Well, you are number 26. You can't collect the thing today. Then they will have to contact you.
okay. Yeah, that's one. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
In my case, back out.
Okay, let's continue with the class. And so what could be the explanation for this growth puzzle? And so we will go back to the institution to understand this, right? So in the LSV argument or the logic, they mainly consider the legal system and the enforcement as the institution, right? But then there's others. One is government, and the other is informal arrangement, right? Which is coming from the culture or the historical background, etc. So we're going to use these two as an explanation. Now, the strand of research, or the economists argue on this, is they have been starting to call China's economy as a state capitalism because it's developing fast, it's getting more advanced over the time, but the state control of the economy remains strong. And this phenomenon is not just in China, they're also in countries like Russia and Brazil, right? And just particularly in China, it's much larger. It still control almost 80% of the economy. And this graph or this information was getting from The Economist in 2012, and that's an article. That's where the state capitalism phrase starts to come. Right, so they're looking at the share of national or the state-controlled companies' capitalization on the national stock market index. So this graph only represents the listed sector, right? Now, of course, there's, in the unlisted sector, I think China's control of economy would be less than 80%. Right, so this is basically saying, among the listed companies, how many portion are state-owned? Right, so China 80, Russia 62, Brazil 38%. And then another way they're looking at is they look at the largest listed company by their revenue around the world and see which one of them or some of them are controlled by state. So the largest was Walmart. Next one was Dutch Shell, which is an oil company, ExxonMobil, BP. These are all oil companies. And the fifth one is Sinopec Group, was China's oil company. And sixth one, still China, and the China National Petroleum, etc. Okay, there were even Japan Post Holdings. Right. So this, by looking at the largest firms listed around the world, they are significant portions. The top 10 actually have 4 are state-owned. Then they can also looking at the share of the national or the state control by the industry sector. Now, no surprising, the energy are the largest the sector that has the largest state control ownership. Then the utility, then the telecommunications, then the financials. Now, these top 3 are no surprising. And in a way we're thinking they should be actually mostly controlled by the state. Why? Energy is like, for example, gas, or utility, like, for example, electricity, right? And telecommunication is the phone lines, etc. What do you think of those products? Those products in the nowadays world become almost the basic, right? And those basic to the very basic needs of the society to operate. So it's almost like close to public goods. You guys know what public goods, right? It's somewhere between the goods that those are the goods like they are not vital as air, but they are much more important and vital compared to, say, just the, any car or bread or those things, right? So these are the ones that's very important for the basic operation of the society. and then also in some sense, strategically important as well. And that's why those sectors tend to be state-owned almost around the world. So even, for example, like ExxonMobil, BP, they are privately owned, but they have tight connections with the government. Okay, so these are the, so this is showing this Economist article showing the state ownership are not just in China, it's many large economies and many important industries. Now, let's come back to look at China's state ownership. So if we're just looking at China's state ownership, and this is, I took a number in 2004 because this is a time in 2005 what happened was the British share structure reform, right? And where they used to be have the state and the legal person, the founders, employee, those first three sectors, three categories of shareholders hold the shares that are not tradable in the market. And in 2005 or end of 2004, this British share structure reform made them all floatable or tradable on the market. So after that, there's much more changing of the ownership. But from this, it will be much easier for us to see the state ownership was close to a third of the shares in the listed company are controlled by the state, while the public or retail small investors are holding about similar level, 1/3, and another 1/3 are controlled by legal person or founders, etc. Right. So this shows that China's state ownership is much larger. While you're wondering why this is 34% and why this early is 80%, because this is looking at the company, right? And this is looking at the actual percentage of shares held on average for each company, right? So if you have a company 80%, the state holds 50% or holds only 20%, but in both cases, if they are the largest, the state is the largest owner, then this is a state-controlled company. Okay. Now, regarding the state control versus free market or private ownership, right? The argument don't just go through SV. It's also a very political argument or the idealism issue, and it's probably in the fundamental conflicts in the US and China because they don't agree with each other's idealism. And the state council, in the Beijing consensus, is thinking the state control are very important and the state influence are important. So there's much more direct influence on the economy or control of the economy or through the ownership of the firms to influence the economy. While the Washington consensus always promotes free market. Of course, it's before Trump. Okay, let's say just before Trump Washington consensus. It's always free market, it's free trade, open trade, let market decide the price and do as much as privatize as much as possible the economy, only the very fundamental one you're holding by the state. Like for example, even in the US, they are state-owned companies as well, right? For example, Fannie Mae, the housing insurance, right? And when the Washington influenced the economy, they like to do interest rate adjustment, right? Or fiscal policy or some deregulation. So the indirect, by changing the incentive of the business or the parameters the business has to operate under with or economic condition, right? But they don't do direct influence of telling company to do. But of course, this is the overall concept. In certain situations, the government might influence, but then again, they will influence through the court. For example, there were cases of one of the Chinese petrol company wants to bid or merge acquisition one of the oil company in US, and that was blocked by the government. But how they block it? It's not a direct order telling the company not to sell, but it was implement it through the court, saying rule out this sector are not allowed for international ownership, right? So this is the major difference around the world. We're using the two biggest political power in the world, how they're looking at private economy versus state control. Now in China, so a lot are state controlled. And the study have been showing some inefficiency, right? So some are showing that among the listed firms after IPO, if the firm are controlled by the state, they tend to underperform, and they tend to have lower productivity, and the allocation of resources are less efficient. And then there are also studies showing that it's not necessarily always bad you have state ownership. And one of the studies we're showing that is because the manager in the large state ownerships, state-owned companies, they have not only the managerial incentive to manage a firm, but also their political career in state, right? So thinking about the CEO managing a very large state-owned companies, if he performs very well, he will have a very good chance to promote in his political career, right? He can climb up his political ladder. And that will give him the additional incentive to run the company very well. Okay. And so and in our old papers that I showed you earlier, right? What we show is actually the private sector drives the growth in China. We have to understand this growth, right? Now, what does it mean in this growth is you can have a state sector keep growing or expanding by putting in or invest resources into this sector, right? But the efficiency, the output could be poor. So that means the expansion of the state sector would be at the cost of a relatively slow, would be even faster private, but because of this misallocation of resources or differential treatment, they are growing slower, right? So if you're looking at the output, the private output is very high compared to the input. How should we compare this? So this is private sector's output. This is private sector's fixed assets investment, right? The growth rate are very similar, and the output are growing even better. But if you're looking at the state sector, the investment is at those rates, 10%, 9%, both mostly positive or sometimes 2 digits. But the output growth rate are much lower. That signals a less productive sector, right? And if you invest most of resources into that relatively less productive sector, that is a misallocation of resources, right? Remember when we talk about in the first class, we talk about the financial market, right? So the market using security, allowing the resources to be allocated more efficiently, because you have lower cost by changing you buying this security or this security, you are moving your assets allocation. And the investor, if they're given free choice, they would always go invest in the sectors that give their better return, right? Now here, because the resources are controlled by the government, and then they have a certain incentive. They are not pure return driven, but they also have certain objective, which is non-financial objective, to develop a certain sector or maintain certain sector size, right? Then you might actually see the misallocation happening. Make sense? Okay. So that's the state capitalism argument, right, and conclusion. The next we're looking at called crony capitalism, which is saying the family ownership, right? So the LSD legal protection statutory is looking at the external market. Those firms are publicly listed, right? And so the shareholders or the creditor and equity holders, they may not know each other. Shareholders may not know each other. And in US and the UK, most of the companies are very diverse. So if they go public, maybe 80% or 90% of shares are all distributed to the public investors. A very small portion may be retained with the fund, and most of them probably don't. Maybe 99% or 100% are all distributed to small investors. So in US, there might be some family-controlled firms, but they might only own like 5%, 10%. But in China, this is much larger, right? Now, the question is, the good thing about publicly listed investor company is a separation of ownership and control, right? You're owned by a bunch of small investors who chip in the money or investing, but managed by professional managers. So these two are separated, right? And these two will have conflicts of interest, right? With the manager doing it in the interest of the shareholders. And the shareholder protection, legal protection, are all about overcoming this agency problem, right? If the management are doing way over sacrificing shareholder or hurting shareholders' interest, then the legal protection or the share investor protection will allow the small investors to change the management, right? Now, in the family ownership, let's say if you have a family-owned firm that brings to public listed, but the family are controlling still 30% as a majority controlling shareholder, then now you have a conflict of interest between the shareholder, the owner, the controlling owner, and the smaller owner, right? Now, what happens to the agency problem between the manager and the shareholder? This actually gets mitigated, right? Because now you have a controlling owner 30%. He has most of the absolute decision power. He might even be able to pick the CEO, right? The CEO will have to keep him happy. So the free rider problem disappears in this case. So the conflicts of interest between shareholder and manager are mitigated. But the conflicts of interest between the controlling shareholder and the minority shareholders are become worse. But the study is showing, so they're looking at studying how the corporate governance looking like in the family-controlled firms. They find that if the CEO are the founder who initially founded this company, this agency problem is actually not severe. And the explanation is often because the CEO is a founder, he has this legacy, and he would like to see the company keep running well. And he has, in his process of bringing to this company, he feels he made commitment, right? He keeps that commitment. But often when the founder died and the children succeed, then things gets kind of going down the slope. And this is very typical around the world as well. You see the family business often survive not for many generations. And occasionally you will see some company is a legacy after 100 years, 200 years, they are still there. And those are very rare. Okay, so these are the current, and the reporters, they basically don't like family ownership. They think the family ownership will provide a tunneling channel. Basically, they think the conflicts of interest between the controlling shareholders and the minority shareholders are very severe. Okay, now what's about the family ownership in China? So in China, the listed percentage number of, it started going up to 61% after 2000, if we only look after 2000. And it's very typical, it's a very typical ownership structure in Asia. Singapore have 49, Hong Kong have 49, right? The lowest in Asia is Philippines, it still have 40%. Okay. Now, that's the ownership, right? Another family source is the loan, the debt. And in our little paper, we find that the family loan is a very important funding sources. And it's probably still the same, particularly for the small in small firms, right? And then the controlling shareholder, but once the quality size on the family controlling shareholder is the conflicts of interest between large shareholders and minority shareholders, right? So the controlling shareholders might expropriate minority shareholder by diverting funds through related party transactions, right? So earlier I already tell you a little bit on that, because at that time I want to illustrate you the pyramid ownership structure, right? The cash rights, voting rights. Now I will restate this, making it much simpler. Suppose you are a family owner of 2 companies. You own 2 companies. One company you own 30%. Another company you own 80%. But both companies you are the controlling shareholders. Now, what means you can divert fund resources through related party transaction? Now the 2 companies A and B, they are related because they have the same controlling shareholders. And any transaction done between them are called related party transactions, and because now they have the same controlling owner, the owner have large influence of how this transaction is done, right? Now suppose he's selling assets that are worth $2 million from, let's say, from company B to company A. Company B he owns. Let's say company A to company B. Company A, he owns 30%. Company B, he owns 80%. Now, these $2 million assets are owned by company A. Now, he decides to sell it to company B. The assets worth $2 million. But he decides to sell it at a price of $1 million. So in this process, what happens? Company A lost $1 million. In this process, right? And he, as a controlling shareholder, 30%, he lost how much was 300,000, right? And the rest of minority shareholder lost 700,000. Now he is also owner of company B. He owns 80%, right? The company B gain $1 million. So in company B, he gains 800,000. While other minority shareholder gain 200,000. This controlling shareholder in net, in this transaction, unfair transaction, he gains $500,000, right? This is called the related party transaction. Now, the minority shareholders of A are not necessarily minority shareholder of B. Or even if they are the same, they are still losing in net $500,000, right? Now, the conflicts of interest is now, how could minority shareholders be ensured that the controlling shareholder will not do something like this? Right? That's the investor protection in the context of when you have family control owners. Okay. Now, on the surface, if the family owners do this type of thing a lot, what would happen? Their share price is going to decrease, right? The investors will be unwilling to invest in their companies, right? So, generally, I mean, not all firms, but most of those firms will try to constrain them from doing such things, thinking because if their share price drops, they might have to, delist, or they will have problem to raise future capitals, right? And then but during extreme time, for example, financial crisis, right, he will have more incentive to do this. Why? Again, in the same situation of he has company A 30%, company B 80%. And in the financial crisis, he may have severe loss and he has limited liquidity, and he wants to save both companies, but what if he can only have the capital to save one? What would he do? Exactly. He will trying to choose a company he has more stakes, right? So he will have incentive to cheap sell company A's assets to B, so that on the balance sheet, the equity on the company B are positive, so he doesn't have to go into bankruptcy, right? And if he really that pushes A to the edge, that if A goes bankruptcy, he still gains in this process, and he could sell, right? So during the Asian financial crisis, they showed that the companies, the family-owned company stock underperformed by 10 to 20% to other firms, because the minority shareholder knows they will do things like that. Now, however, related to this, in this transaction, the company with 80% of shares would have a better chance to survive, right? And this is also approved by the studies they're showing us after Asian financial crisis, particularly Korean, etc. Those companies have family ownership or they have business group related, they survive better. They get out of the crisis better. Now, another way for the controlling shareholders to sort of providing the minority shareholder a guarantee or a signal of guarantee that he is not going to expropriate or tunneling is through paying out a dividend, right? When you're still paying out a dividend, a lot of assets or the values will be paid to the shareholders, so less will remain in the company to allow for the transfer or the expropriation, right? So the dividend policy can be viewed as a way or a commitment to low expropriation, right? Now, but this signal is actually used a lot in Western companies, but not so much in Asian companies. This is another puzzle people don't understand, because the family ownership is common in Asia, but also common in Europe. And around the world, the countries that has less family ownership is US and the UK. They are the two very big ones, don't have. But the European and the Asian have common family ownership. And even US have certain family ownership as well. We will less talk there. So the Asian firms pay less dividends than the Western European firms. That's another question of why. And there's no formal study on this, but people are proposing the family value, because a lot of those family firms might not just have one family controls, but they might also have their relatives controls. So those also give them incentive or watching power, monitoring power. Okay, so those are the dividends. Then other than this, we're talking about there's also informal financing in the governance we mentioned a bit earlier, right? Those informal financial institutions and also the local government or the mutual village leaders, etc., get into the governance issues, right? Now, so in our paper, we show the private sector in China are discriminated in access to finance, but although the private sector have weak legal protection, they actually grow the fastest, and there exist effective alternative financing channels and governance mechanism, such as those based on reputation relationship to support this growth. Now, those informal mechanism, you have to admit, with the economy or the technology become more modern, they are less likely to play the role, right? Thinking about the informal mechanism done based on the reputation among a community. In the old time, if you are, the community are very tight, and if you borrow your friends' money and invest and you lose it, you sort of have a reputation of a failure business, right? It makes you much harder to be able to borrow from other people. But nowadays, with this P2P stuff things going on, you have thousands of P2P platform going on. You can fail here, but you register account in another account, right? Those discipline will be much weaker. But then, this is in the Western, you're thinking of they don't have this, but they still have. But except now they legalized it, right? they will keep your bankruptcy records. That's exactly the reputation, which is in the old time was informal, but with more legality development become formal. Right? They will have your bankruptcy records. Now, China is exactly in the middle of this thing. We don't know whether it's going to transit this way or the other way, right? The community are now they start breaking up, and not everywhere. Like, for example, there's Wenzhou business group. I mean, there's many like that, Sanshi business group. They are still operating this. Thinking about all those firms getting together. If one of the firms start behaving crazily, the other firm, you're kicking him out, right? So he will lose. So this reputation is still working there. But China don't have the centralized records of yet. You can cheat in one city and run to another city and keep doing this. Right, so this is the issue that China is actually right now in the middle of this chaos of certain mechanisms breaking down, new mechanisms haven't been started to break up. Now, so this is actually not important, so you can just look through it. Okay. Now, so overall, if we compare China, we see this early already, right? It's not doing great on this one, but then we can looking at it's overall not doing very great. Now, we do know that China has a large, inefficient banking sector. And what you hear recently is about the shadow banking, etc., right? So the informal financing involves a large part of loans outside of the banking sector. We said the private sector only has 0.24 of credits over GDP, right? So the private sector are not getting much credits from the banking sector. Where do they get it? Right? So informal financial institutions, and they could get in some foreign banks nowadays as well, and also other shadow banking, etc. Now, in domestic bank and in China has about 4,000 plus, and the foreign institutions has about 1,000 plus. Okay, these are the older numbers, now should be a bit higher. Okay, there's a lot of regulation on the foreign banks. For example, they cannot, for a long time, they cannot deal with individual investors, household. They can only deal with the corporation, etc. And most, then they also have certain limits on their leverage, etc. And most of them enter China's market by collaboration with domestic financial institutions. Okay. Now, in this process, of course, these Chinese banks are also industry are also getting some benefits. They learn more technology, etc., something like that, right? Now, another one is informal financing or shadow banking. This is a very interesting topic. Just like earlier I mentioned to you the case of Wu Ying, right? This has been what she does of collecting money is a very common practice for a long time in many provinces as well. Even in Wenzhou or in Zhejiang, many are doing it. So, yeah, this is being recorded, right? I will say it anyway. So I think in the case, they're saying is her investment are losing money, but we don't have the records to trace to say yes or no on this. But this informal financing goes through this periods like this as well. In the 80s, they were very much encouraged because the banking at China at that time is very limited developed because you guys have no idea of the planned economy, right? Before 76, okay, if we go back long history, there'll be even more. Okay, let's say after the People's Republic China is established, the banking sector was consolidated just one big one. And it's a planned economy. Every year, how much this funding goes to this province, in this province goes to this company, how many? They are all state-owned companies, right? They are all decided by the officials or the banking officials. So they are allocated. right? They might have some loan applications that are all bureaucratic application, not economic application. And then this all, so when the economy start to open doors, they start to allow private ownership, right, give more rights to the firm, to the money itself. Some of the bank revive, for example, Bank of Communication, Bank of Construction, Merchant Bank, etc., right? Those are the banks actually existed before 49 as well. They sort of somehow in the middle disappeared for a while. Then they sort of consolidated into this one huge just bank. And after 78, they start to revive. But still, there's very limited number of the banks, right? A lot of enterprise cannot getting money. Particularly, you guys probably know Deng Xiaoping, right? You have to know Deng Xiaoping, right? After 92, he is encouraging before him, there was Hu Yaobang, okay? They were all encouraging private sector, etc. But those private enterprise needs funding. And they are not in the formal official allocation zone, right? Where they're getting the money. So at that time, there was already a lot of informal financing going on. And, in the countryside, the TVE, the town village enterprises are developing. And they are getting money, and maybe some of you getting from countryside, you know, in the before, when was that? Also 78, 70? They have the Soviet Union type of farm. Everybody are together, lands are together, all the households are together. Then they have the common property of this machinery, you know, helping the agriculture, right? And then they had the separate, how to say, they give the operation rights of the land or the field to the farmers. The ownership is still with the government. Now the farmers are no longer together. Instead, they will plant their own fields, right? And then they have their own proceeds. Now, what happens to those common assets? Many of this starts to operate like a financing company, etc., leasing company, right? So those are all informal institutions. And so those in the city and in the countryside, there were informal institutions. They were in the 80s actually praised because they are helping the China's economic transition, right? There were actually formal documents showing even the central bank are asking the other commercial banks saying, look at those informal institutions, they operate much more efficiently. You guys need to learn from them, right? But in the 90s, so particularly in the 94, it's actually, let me say less about politics. I'm not going to mention any leader's name from this point onwards. There was policy changes. And those informal institutions start to be labeled as illegal. And Wynn's case pretty much happened around the time, right? So many of those informal institutions was breaking down at the time, not all. Many of them still even existing today. And then even more recent, because of the Western has a shadow banking issue, right? Seems the system of assuming we are finishing class now. Okay. Should it be coming up? Yeah. Okay. You do this thing. Okay. I'm getting good at this. And another one probably at the both side. Okay. Right, so now they start to call them shadow banking. And of course, the shadow banking also adding more components into it. For example, P2P started as a great thing, everybody praise it, and now because it breaks down and you know the default issues, now it's called shadow banking, and they're trying to do a lot of things, right? So overall, this process, what you see is when the formal mechanism can't achieve certain goal, the informal mechanism by people, they will establish to try to deal with this problem, right? But in this process, they may either lack of regulation, they may lack of certain other things in the system. So to some point, when they develop it booming too big, they will bring in problems, right? And because whatever institutions or there's lack of the correct policy to regulate them, to ensure them to operate in a reasonable way. So the government often just can only take the approach of just abandon them, right? And this doesn't necessarily reflect idealism. That could be idealism, but also could be lack of expertise. Maybe the policymakers may just don't have enough expertise to knowing or foreseeing when they have P2P coming up. Nobody's foreseeing how it could go, and therefore we should implement certain regulation now. Because the P2P are also happening in US. And it doesn't have those crazy default issues like in China. Of course, there's always default, but not like in China. Okay, so I think this is pretty much, I covered all those things without reading the slides anymore, right? Okay, so basically the message is the informal financing or shadow banking, they have their certain advantage. They emerged to deal with certain inefficiency in the formal mechanism. But admittedly, in the certain stage, they might actually went wrong. But it will be too abrasive just to abandon the whole thing, while the formal mechanism haven't had enough mechanism established to support the private sector's growth. Right. Okay, and this is just showing the size. I think that's about it for the course, but we are not finishing yet. We're going to talk about the project, okay? So today I'll hand out the project. So let me first tell you, the case, this is a case, and the case are bought from the Harvard business case, so they actually sell for each copies. If it's free, then I can just make as many copies as possible. And because it's paid, I have to mark number, and I can only make exactly the number of copies we need because that's the number we pay, the school pay for it. And I should also do as much as I could, so I will mark a number here. So that means which group has this. And I also should request you guys not to make extra copies, because they supposedly each copy will make we should pay, and we only paid 50 copies. Okay, so there will be actually the number I'm going to mark to 52, but there are some group in the middle console. For example, we don't have team number 4, we don't have team number 13, and there's also team number 41 or 40 somewhere there. Okay, so don't make copies. Supposedly, if you make copies, I see this, it's your fault. Okay, not my fault. Okay, maybe I give you now, and each of your team, just one of you getting it should be good. Group number 1, team number 1, anybody remember? Or now you remember your team number? Group 1, okay. Well, if you can come to me, it will be easier. Okay, number 2. In the order, if you remember number 2, number 3, team 3, team 5, team 6, team 6, team 7, 5, 7, and 8. We'll put a number 9, 10, 11, 12, 14, 10, 14, 15, 10. Somebody took it. It was difficult. 12, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 19, 20, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 30, 29, 31. Okay, this card in 31, 26. Somebody took it already, yeah. 32, 33, 32, 34, 26. Somebody must be gone. 26. Your group member is looking for you. 35, 36, 37, 39, 40, 44, or 41, sorry, 41, 42, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 49, 50, 51, 52. Are you group 17? You send them a message on the WhatsApp. Tell them you have. Well, then they should. That's the teamwork issue now. Okay. Okay. Group 26. Yeah. Group 27, 17. 17. Nobody here. Okay. Anyone you think your group member haven't got to the case and you haven't? Okay. There's many people on the come. None of them come. $33. Yeah. Okay. Which number? 31? Just 30, yeah. Somebody, I think, took it already. Oh, yeah, here. Mm-hmm. Okay, you just have to keep it send. That's your group teamwork issue, yeah, yeah. Okay, so now let me tell you what this project is about and what you should approach it, okay, or what you're supposed to, we're trying to achieve or your learning process, or it's more actually a process to force yourself to think about real problem and do the research and making decisions. Okay, keep this in mind. So you are more like facing a business case, you need to solve the problem, or there's particular output or thing or your boss is expecting you to deliver. Now, this case's objective is to help you understand the fintech industry development in China. The fintech industry is very interesting, right? It's like a finance and a technology adding together. And a lot of new things are being created, like P2P or crowdfunding, or a lot of wealth management products that are not going through the bank anymore, right? Those are somewhere informal, shadow banking, formal, we don't know yet. I mean, they have all those elements. They have all those elements in. And the government's regulation is a bit here, a bit there, not systematic either. And so in this case, we will focus on one particular, let's call it company, Lufax. So how many of you know the Chinese name of it? Okay, we do have 叫陆交所，对吧？陆金所 ，OK， 陆金所 ，OK。And so what you want to see this is you want to looking at the understand fintech industry, and you want to understand Lufax business model. What other their activities do? How do they do income, and what service they provide? What is their income, cost, and the risk? Thinking about how do we discuss each financial institutions, right? You're thinking about their business model, the activity service they provide, and how they're making profit and what's the risk. And you also want to analyze the effects, industry competition, regulatory challenging, etc. Now, all this actually, most of the case, you're going to have many, many pages, right? They actually give you a summary of that, or description, not just summary, actually quite a detail, right, on those. And you can read this, and you can supplement more information through your research. And at the end, once you do this, you're going to propose a business strategy for Lufax. This business strategy can address in the next 3 to 5 years what happens, or strategically to prepare for 5, 10 years. And most importantly, and this is my training for you guys, free training, nobody does that, people do that as well, is assess your own strategy. And you guys probably very familiar, right? Many people, not only just students, even a lot of economists you see in the media, they like to talk, government should do this, do that, you should do this, do that. But does those claims actually valid? So you assess something, you propose something. Do assess your own proposal, okay? So in your report, you have the business strategy supported with analysis and assessed with possibility of success and failure. Got it? Okay, keep this in mind. If someday you in business world, you do reports or business plan like this, and you have this, your colleague don't have this, you will impress your boss much better than others. This is very important. Now the background, which are all in this handouts of the case, they describe the Lufax business model, its ownership, the service products, and it also talks about Ping An's AI, artificial intelligence capacity, which is on technology side, right? There's a bit discussion on the demand. You could maybe even do better. And there's quite some discussion on the competition, on the Alibaba, Tencent, the financial service as well. And the risk, there's quite some discussion on the risk provided. So those, you will read the case carefully. You have good understanding of them. And you could also do more research, right? Now, once you understand the case, the background, or the situations the business are in, the industry and how they do it, you want to consider those questions. What are the challenges of the business currently, on their past, currently, or going forwards, right? And how should Lufax respond to these challenges? Of course, even the case itself in the description, they will say, what is this challenge with 1 sentence, 2 sentences? But you need to be able to understand more in depth. And also the response, what you have to elaborate better, okay? What should be the particular approach or business plan in terms of the technology side or the finance side, what can do with the business model? And will this plan works? What could be the risk? What could be the projected, which is according to your strategy or business plan, could be the project outcome and the scenarios, right? So when you do all those things, consider all those questions, you have to go back reviewing the competition, right? The demands, the risks, the ownership, all those backgrounds, you have to build up to here. Understand? Right? So your business plan has to consider all those factors and address them accordingly. Now, finally, once you do all those, you will do a report. So what you have, the assignment when you finish the products handed to me is a report. Okay, I don't need the report for too long, and 1 to 5 pages, or maybe 3 to 5 pages. One will be too short. Okay, and in this report, you want a brief description of the background, the business model, etc. Right? Pretty much the background you are getting this thick. You want to condense it. I'm almost hands-on hands to tell you what to do now. Okay, describe it. Then you will provide your analysis. The analysis along what line? On the guideline, the business model, ownership, competition, demands, risk, right? All this along. You're going to provide the analysis along these lines, right? And once you do the analysis, of course, those analysis can be verbal, but would be also great to support with numbers or comparisons, right? Comparison with more developed fintech company, etc., in China or even overseas, if you can find a case like that. And also, the analysis had to show the logic. That's where I can see the difference among the groups, from group to group. When you conduct this analysis and your logic argument, I can see how much understanding of the depths of the financial market, financial service coming in. Okay? And then once do all the analysis, according to this analysis should naturally lead to your recommendation, right? Because those analysis, if you do correct, is going to tell you what's the advantage, disadvantage, shortcomings, the problems need to address, right? And those will naturally lead into your recommendation of the business plan or strategic development plan. Okay, then after you do this, you do an assessment. Now, assessment, how do you approach this? How many of you take corporate evaluation course? That can help you quite a lot, right? And in there, you must do a scenario analysis of the valuation, right? How the professor tells you guys how to do it. You're looking at macro environment, industry environment, right? And particularly business situation. And you consider other unexpected events, etc., international environment, etc., right? So from there, you assess your plan, whether it could work or not work, what is scenario of success or not success. Okay, so now I mentioned this in the first class, you guys have division of work, right? So if you just divide, you do this, I do this, then there's one thing you have to be very careful is this consistency, right? I don't want to say description. The description could be separate, but even can be connected. Right? The analysis, recommendation, and assessment, they should be all coherent with each other. They can't be separated down. Okay, so just really careful with this. And be concise. Remember, I only need 3 to 5 pages. If you have to go more than 5 pages with graph stuff, that's okay. Right? You have tables, graphs, you want to support certain things beyond 5 pages, that is fine. But the report that I'm reading through mainly, no more than 5 pages, please, okay? And any important things, there should be ways to say it. Any issue, you could say it in 3 sentences, 3 pages, or whole book, okay? So we want somewhere 3 to 5 pages. You see what I'm saying, right? Okay. If you understand the issue, you will have this ability of making it very short or big. What was the saying of, you reading a book, you read it thin, and then you read it thick again. Okay, maybe you guys didn't hear this idiom. Okay, that's about the project. Any questions? Go ahead.
Do we have an example of format of this report, or we just design by ourselves?
This almost tells you the format now. Description is like executive summary, right? Any other questions? Go ahead. Yes, if you cite something, you borrow people's graph, you say the reference.
So the reference is not involved.
It doesn't, yeah, if you don't count it in the 5 pages, yeah, it's okay, additional okay. You can't cite that, but you have to translate in writing in English. You're probably going to, most of the resources you're looking maybe in Chinese actually, yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so if not, it's today's class, and then I want to just remind you, next class is week 4. We will do an in-class quiz at the end of the course again, okay? We start lecturing, then at the end of the course, we do a quiz. And the quiz, don't panic, you have 15 minutes, and it's going to be simple. I just want you guys to have an idea of what is a midterm or final exam looking like, right? The question. So it's basically, it's just core multiple choice, just one correct answer. Okay, it's a choice question and a calculation question. Several choice questions and a calculation question. Okay. There will be. If you have been in class, you understood the calculation should be. 1 second. Yeah, should be okay. Yes, yes. You'll be fine. Yes. And there's a question there? Go ahead. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, I see next week we're going to talk about, what's the next week? We're going to talk about here. Lecture notes. I'll do this and then wait. So next week we will talk about a bit on the RMB convertibility and because following China, and then also some on the growth path of Indian, its explanation, okay, and the quiz, okay. So that might also be quizzed. I don't think you need to panic about this. Yeah, if you have been in the class, should be all fine. But of course, if you want to start to review, it's also good. Okay.
Because I didn't know any of them. I just, I could only message them because I couldn't see whether they are postgraduate or graduate students. But no one replies me. I don't know any about them.
If you want to email, if you use a name, in the email account, there is a directory. Try to spell name, you might find their email address.
But can I now check their post or graduate students?
I
I'm afraid.
don't know how to check either.
Okay. I just didn't see. I never looked at it. Okay. So if I just, if I put their graduate students, can I maybe next week I choose the groups?
If you want to change the group, you have to find the swap yourself. I can't find for you. Yeah. If you find somebody willing to swap with you, I'm okay. Then you can both come to my office or send me joint email or something.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure whether my group takes the quiz.
What's your group number?
45. Yeah. The quiz it will concern the week 1 to week 4.
Yes, week 1 to week 4.
So we need to read the.
It should be relatively easy.
So the quiz will cover the 4 weeks.
Yeah, yes.
So next week is also.
Yes. Just a choice question. It's all fresh, you wouldn't forget.
And one calculation.
Yeah.
Is it in week 2?
Yes, because till now only week 2 has the calculation related.
Yes.
So, what about the next week? Is it in
No calculation.
Just the
I just want to double check, with the harder business case, are we restricted to, for the assignment that is, are we restricted to only using the materials that's in the business case, or can we go outside?
You can go outside.
Ah,
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Group help me find the group because our friend is a postgraduate and I'm a bachelor, so I can make group with my friend and also email some students.
You still have to sign up for the group?
Yeah. Because many students
Well, you should just sign up at the time. It should be signing up.
because my course is overlap.
Your course is overlap. What are you? So you can't come to the.
Yeah, so
You can't come to class at all.
yeah.
Can you just don't look at me when I type my password?
Okay, sorry. Because upstairs also is my class.
So today you only come today for the class for the group only.
Yeah,
You
and,
usually can't take the class. Come to the
yeah,
class.
but I need to listen to the video because the upstairs class have the quiz every week.
Well, but you don't have the class time now, right?
Yeah, we have, but because today's class is cancelled,
Which class is that?
Economic 2101.
And I have to keep it. Why don't you send me an email with your address? With your email address. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you just send me an email?
Send me email?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Excuse me. Yeah, the next week's quiz is a closed book, right?
Yes.
And multiple choice question and calculation,
Calculation, yeah.
including the
Week 1 to
lecture
week 4. Yes.
you cut.
Yes.
And is there any practice questions or
That's your practice for the midterm and the final.
so only the quiz for that? No
Yeah.
other.
There's no need for this is multiple choice. What you need to practice for multiple choice. I said in the first class, this course is more conceptually understanding. There's not much calculation. You don't need a practice for calculation.
All right.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
No problem.